Welcome to Slight Reliability, the show where we learn SRE and observability 1 week at a time. I'm Stephen Townsend.
Welcome back to Slight Reliability. I'm Stephen Townsend, and this is the show where we learn about SRE and observability 1 week at a time. Today, Amin Astaneh is back. Hello.
Hey.
Amin is a consultant at a company, Certo Modo, where he helps transform tech companies using DevOps and slight reliability engineering best practices. He's been doing this kind of transformation work full-time since 2016 for medium and large companies as a manager and a team lead, and now he lends that experience to his clients. Amin was the guest on episode 59, which was From Zero to SRE, which was, if you weren't aware, the most popular interview I've ever done on the podcast. So,
wow, it's an honor.
Today, we're talking about your experience at Meta. Is that right? Is that what we're talking about today?
Yeah, we're talking about my experience at Meta, formerly known as Facebook.
There's a question not on the list that I wanted to ask you. What was the interview process like?
Oh, what a question. Right. So interviewing at big tech companies is a completely different experience than interviewing for anything else. It is a pretty big process. So it happens in two stages. The first stage is you're doing the screen, and for production engineers, which is like SRE, but Facebook's interpretation of it, as I'm sure we'll talk about more, the screen is you have the coding interview, and then you have a systems interview. And both of them are 45 minutes long, and they're like multi-part, and there's multiple questions, and they really see what you're about. If you manage to get through the screen, you then have the full interview loop. So when I interviewed, it was October 2019, which was before COVID, of course. So I was flown out from Boston to Menlo Park, California, and went on the Facebook Classic campus and went and did multiple interviews. So another coding, another systems, a systems design, behavioral, especially as a manager. And then if you're coming in as a PE, you might also do a networking interview. So it's a full day of interviews. And then they send you back, and then they submit your packet to a panel. The panel talks about it, and then hopefully you are given an offer. That's the process.
Wow. I've been reading quite a few books recently that are talking about coding interviews, or and blogs as well, and coding under time pressures, and how it's not a very good sort of measure of how well someone can code. It's much better to give someone a task to go away on and work on, because some people just don't handle that kind of intensity. And I completely get that.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. Believe it or not, I just did a talk here in Vegas about how to do a coding interview in this setting. So all of that information is currently paged in my head right now, so I could talk a bit intelligently about it. Yeah, you're right. It's high pressure. It requires a lot of practice and preparation. Like, I took a week off from my job and then went and just practiced. I mean, like several hours a day, every day, and then flew out to California to go do it. So yeah, it's a pretty involved thing.
Oh yeah, and you are currently traveling around the United States, is that right?
That's right. As you would probably say, I am on walkabout. I've only lived in two cities in my lifetime, which was the Boston area most recently, and then I grew up in Tampa. So I am taking my consultancy on the road. Every couple months, I'll go and visit a different city, see what it's about, and see if it's a good candidate for me to put down roots. So I've first went to Phoenix during the height of the hot temperatures and dealt with that, and driving around in my car all sweaty. And now I'm in Vegas. So Vegas is very interesting because I was at DEF CON last week, the computer security conference, which is really fun, by the way. And now getting used to this area and seeing what it's all about and checking out the scene.
You weren't one of the hundreds of people who caught COVID at the conference?
I did not catch COVID, and yes, I did test myself, though I think for a day or two I felt a little under it, but I did do a test and it was negative.
So let's talk about your time at Meta in the production engineering team. What's the story?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So production engineering came out, I think, in like the early 20 teens at Meta. Previously, they had a a site reliability engineering team, but the way that they were going about it is not, when I say SRE, that's not quite what they were doing. It was a lot of like production operations. And then they had a separate group called AppOps, I believed, that was responsible for like basically operating, the backend services. And they evolved over a number of years and created production engineering. An interesting bit about production engineering that is distinct from like Google SRE, for example, is there's a pretty big emphasis around an equal distribution of responsibility when it comes to on-call. Like they have the principle, you build it, you own it when it comes to on-call. So software engineers, are on call in all cases for the services that they're running. There's never like a delegation of on-call responsibility to a separate PE team. PEs tend to be embedded on software engineering teams. Like in our last conversation, I was talking about the embedded model. They definitely do the embedded model, though they do have situations where there are teams that are 100% production engineering, and they're building like a core service, like infrastructure service that the company depends on. But that's the MO, it tends to be embedded model. Everyone's on call, including SWE.
From my limited experience, I have heard the sort of anecdotes that not all software engineers want to be on call. And there's a bit of pushback, or they might want it, I just want to write great code. I don't want to, have to deal with this other stuff. And it's a whole different set of skills. So how does that work?
Well, I think it happens as a matter of necessity. For one thing, at the time I was at Meta, I think there was like only 1,000 to 1,200, PEs in the entire company. And you have, a software engineering body that is an order of magnitude larger. So there wasn't really a situation where, a SWE on a team can say, oh, I don't want to be on call. Everybody was on call, from the start. So I think that organizational momentum kind of forced the issue, since, again, there was a huge minority of PEs and operational folks from the beginning.
So if it was happening from the beginning, you wouldn't have to go necessarily through a process of, this is how we're going to uplift our software engineers into, so that they're capable of dealing with on-call. It was already there from the start. That's
correct. Like in contrast, when I was at Acquia, there was an operations team. There was a split in the early game of the company. So I had to, guide a cultural change to bring those two teams back together and make it so that everyone was on call. But at Meta, everybody was on call from the start.
When we chatted a couple of weeks ago, you were talking about how everyone had different areas of sort of expertise. What was your area of expertise?
Yeah, so at Meta, I focused a lot on observability and on-call and incident response and that practice. And the reason why is that on the teams that I embedded on, they were all, reasonably early to mid stage. There was a particular team that I was on that I guess the analog is like an internal version of Heroku. So bring your code, simple backend services, we would run it for you and stand up all of the infrastructure and all of the CI/CD and monitoring and everything. So when I joined, it was in beta, I believe. So, at the bottom of the reliability pyramid, what do you have? You have monitoring and metrics and incident response. So in order to start any reliability program, we need to start there. Thus, it was natural for me as the first PE on the team to do that work.
Kind of drilling a little more into the model of SRE engagement. It's one of these things I've actually talked to quite a few people about and thought about a lot. So Google has that, I don't know how you would, a centralized SRE team. I don't know if it's global, if it's the way that it still is now, or that if it's consistently always this way. You have a centralized team who will sort of loan out SREs to different teams with a sort of agreement that if the service isn't available or it's too hard to work, they can just step away and say, we're not doing this anymore. So that's their model. How would you describe the model at Facebook at the time as embedded? How did that differ? Right,
good question. So yes, there is a separate reporting line for PE up to a point. There's a separate reporting line, a different set of managers and skip managers and directors and everything. And yes, like we are assigned, to engineering teams. So that's also similar. Another similar bit is the voting with your feet. So a PE, so long as they are performing well and their rating is good, they can usually on like every 6 months or on an annual basis, they can shop around for other teams to join. And the effect of such a dynamic where, a PE can vote with their feet is that there is an inherent incentive for the team to build, operate, and prioritize, work on a service where the PEs are not in like an untenable situation. So there have been situations where PEs are like, you know what, this isn't working for me, and they'll move on to a different team, and that creates, downstream effects to how the team behaves once they leave.
There's a certain element of kind of, the word's a bit dirty, but meritocracy. Like if you are good at what you do, you have options and you can move around, and that's fine. Which I quite like. I'm actually reading a book. We have at Squid Up this leadership book club, and we're currently reading collectively The Song of Significance. It's kind of about leadership and the economy and the industry and society and how it's structured, and that generally most organizations would not have. They would discourage that kind of thing. They would say, you are on this team, we're in control of you, and they would very much limit or try not, they wouldn't want you to be aware of other opportunities even within the same company, and try and hide, shelter you from that. So that's a nice change of pace.
Yeah, it definitely is. In my personal experience, being that I was in Boston, which is a satellite office, when I joined the company, actually, they're like, oh, you have a choice of this team? And that's the choice you have. So my I was pre-allocated, as it were. Now, luckily, the team I was joining was really cool. It was and still is like one of the largest CI/CD platforms on the planet. So like I was already very much turned on to joining this team and making contributions, right? But usually where things are interesting is if you are in a larger space, let's say Menlo Park, the headquarters, of course, or New York or something. So when you onboard, like when you join the company and you get trained up in boot camp, which is a 5 to 6 week process where you're taking classes and going through labs and coursework to learn how things work. There's a period around week 4 or 5 when you are available to be reached out to by other teams. And it's like a dating app. Everybody is just reaching out to you saying, hey, our team's really cool. You want to sit with us? You want to check out our tech? And, there's high demand for your presence, and you get to pick and choose what team you want to join. So that dynamic is in there from the beginning.
That embedded model, though, I think we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, does it work in smaller organizations? Like right now, my company has just under 100 staff. My previous company had 13,500 staff, but only like 1,000, 1,500 engineers, software engineers total across all disciplines. Would the embedded model work in a smaller organization?
It can, with some caveats. So when I was at Acquia, that was around 1,000 people. I had 10 to 15 SREs that reported to me, and I was allocating them to teams. Now, the thing about it, though, is there is a lot more responsibility placed on the management chain, particularly like the SRE managers, to make sure that the engagements are, in fact, productive.
Okay.
Because since you have such a small body of time and engineering effort that you can invest, you have to make sure that the return on investment of that engineer on that team for that term is profitable, is productive. So it puts a lot of, in my situation, it put a lot of responsibility on me to do one-on-ones, not just with my team, which is kind of implicit as a manager, but also with, the peers on the team they're embedding on, with the tech lead, with the product manager, and just making sure everyone is aligned in moving towards, the mission of why the SRE is on there. Because I've had situations where the SRE, goes native and starts working on, features and completely forgot that, they're a SRE and there is a goal that they are doing. Right. And then on the other side, I've seen, situations where the SRE is not enabled, or the team isn't necessarily participating in the process and aren't like thinking about SLOs or, taking postmortem seriously. So as a manager responsible for these engagements, you have to be paying very close attention to make sure that you're like getting the value for that investment of that engineer on that team. Like I mentioned before, it's like running a consultancy, which is probably why I'm a consultant now.
I actually wanted to run by the way that we attempted to do SRE in my previous company, just to see what you thought about how the engagement model and whether it could have been better. So the company was, like 1,500 engineers, fairly big insurance company. There was no concept of SRE. There were, for the most part, split ops and dev teams, and a lot of sort of teams that owned components. Were not necessarily like value streams, like it wasn't microservice and the thinking around that yet in place. And so the model that we used, it was sort of a bottom-up approach where we formed a small team of 4 people who were a bit like a consultancy or an enablement team, is what you would probably call us. And we would basically go to teams who wanted to improve. They would say, we want to do better. And then we would go, okay. So we would go and like figure out with them where are the opportunities to improve. We tried embedding to the point that we would be on call, like try and get upskilled to be on call with them. That was hard because we would try and have these sort of short engagements for like 3 to 6 months, and it's hard to get up to speed and be on call and feel the pain and then with them, and then they're like, well, it was hard. So that was challenging. But yeah, we did things like improve their observability was a big one. Try and implement SLOs. And sort of assess their level of reliability and their operational work and look for ways they could streamline that. But it was very much ground level. It wasn't sort of like the CTO or CEO was saying, we're going to do this. It was, we're trying to do it from a fairly ground level. How does that stick out? How would you in that situation attempt to get SRE running in a company like that?
For sure. I actually took just a few bit of notes while you're describing this. And put my consultant hat on, so this is cool. So there's a few things that jumped out at me about your description of how you implemented SRE. So the consulting model actually does make sense because you have a very limited number of engineers, and then you are trying to interact with a whole bunch of teams. Now the feedback I have. If you were to do this again, there's a few things that I would say. Number one, in a consulting model like this, on call is ride out. The reason why I don't recommend that you do on call in a model like this is because you don't have enough time to gain sufficient context on the service that you're or the team that you're helping with in order for you to be productive as an on call. Now there is a caveat to this. There is an exception to this rule. You could, as a team, create a rotation. Something that Facebook or Meta does is called Incident Management on Call, IMOC, where you don't need to know the nature of the service, but you are responsible for being a point of escalation to help guide an incident to resolution. And, making sure that the C-level or other departments know what's going on, and, making the executive decision to escalate to other teams and getting people on a video chat or whatever is necessary to remediate the incident. So, I could see a consulting model, SRE team doing like an IMOC type situation, but not embedding on, like not trying to hybrid embed and hybrid consult, like it's one or the other. To that end, I think one of the things that could have been an opportunity, since you had a team of 4, is you could have found one team that was hungry for the change and was bought in and was high profile and embed one engineer on there. So the reason why I'm saying that is then you use that as your case study. Hey, look, we got an SRE. We embedded them on their team in 6 months. We reduced their operational burden by 50%, their alerts by 80%. We got SLOs on the board. Look how awesome this is, right? And then you shout that from the rooftops. You bring that to C-level and say, hey, we have a successful, engagement here. Let's rinse and repeat. And then your team could have gotten larger. You could have had more C-level support. Right, so there is a sales part of it. Like you need to be able to find the low-hanging fruit, the short-term wins, and then build momentum. I know I'm talking a little bit from John Cotter's Leading Change. But yeah, it's a change leadership effort. You need that one big win to build credibility.
I love that you said that there's a sales part to it. And yeah, exactly. With this kind of work, if you're trying to get it to take off, you have to sell internally and you need a track record and evidence to say, look what we did. I think that's a skill that we don't really get taught. It's just a thing you just are expected to just know through the ether. But it sounds like it's the kind of thing which is one of those, it makes or breaks a career, a team, a practice, an organization.
That's right. For better or worse, I think I just revealed to your listeners my secret. My secret is there is a social element to the change that you're driving as an SRE. You are not going to be able to do the work by yourself. You are selling the idea of reliability. You're selling the idea of toil management, right? You're selling the idea of SLOs and process and blameless postmortems. And then you have to take those wins and make sure that they are socialized. That is a big chunk of my work as a change leader at those companies, as well as a consultant now.
Another thing that we did in that team was we started building the observability portal because there was monitoring happening in different teams, but it was kind of sporadic, and we wanted a way to sort of surface the sort of key health, and to say, look, we're going to maybe we have this reliability benchmark. How available are your services? What are the 4 golden signals like for your key services, and also how many incidents are you dealing with, and how many deployments do you do, and how frequently? And we wanted to surface this in a way that everyone in the company and they could see and track over time. And there was just no way to do that. So we built this platform. So we became a hybrid enablement team and platform team, which is. We were too small for that, really. I think ideally, I would, if I stayed there, I'd want to split that into 2 different teams. The team who runs the observability platform and then the consulting SRE team. Is that how you would do things?
I think so. And in terms of measuring and centralizing, performance metrics across teams, that's tricky. And there's a couple of reasons why. One, you probably want to establish that type of competency or that type of thing a little bit in the later game, where there's been enough opportunity for teams to go and implement SRE, because there can be a backlash where you're trying to do assessments against teams, and then you might have C-level looking at these measurements and using them as incentives or KPIs, which is a big no-no. I think you've made a post about that on LinkedIn recently or something. So when you start putting up metrics like that centralized across teams, that could create a butterfly effect of things you're not anticipating. But, down the road, let's say you have teams there's enough of them, a critical mass of teams that are doing SRE practices and there's engagements and they're doing SLOs and they're doing, gathering these types of DORA style metrics. Yeah, then you can do that. And then that can be a mechanism for your SRE organization to say, oh, look, here are some teams that are a little hot right now. They have certain metrics that are not healthy. Maybe that is a candidate for an engagement, right? So you're already figuring out where to invest your time based on, of course, the business value of that particular team. And then, of course, the operational risk that it represents. So that dot product produces actually a list of teams you can go serve on. So there is a benefit to that. But I think in the medium to late game, I would implement that.
Okay. But at the same time, maybe without publishing it across the company, but doing that kind of assessment, my instinct was it was the right thing to do because it gave us a benchmark of where we're at now so we can see where to improve. But maybe we don't tell everyone about that.
No, you're right. So there is a assessment that I've been using for years. And if readers probably recognize the book, The Practice of Cloud System Administration, Appendix A has something called the Operational Responsibility Assessment. And what that is just a bunch of questions across a bunch of verticals around operational responsibility. And that will help you be able to assess the maturity of services and teams. And then, so yeah, sure, you could, have teams perform the assessment internally and not, you're not publishing it and triggering feelings of shame, right? Yeah. But you can use it to figure out what gaps or low-hanging fruit are definitely available. I actually, when I was at Acquia, that was one of the first things we did is run the assessment. It wasn't until later on we started thinking about like, oh, well, let's publish them and have a matrix and we can start seeing where teams are at and then, using that as a forcing function to drive maturity socially. But yes, you're right. You could do assessments in the early game. It's just about how you socialize them.
Okay. SRE seems to be a thing, we've already covered a bit of it, that you would probably address in different ways in different scales of organization. So I work for a small org now. I used to work for, I would call a fairly large enterprise in this part of the world, 13,500 staff, You've worked at high, or what I consider like hyperscale, massive global organizations. And something you were talking about, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, was how in very large organizations you have these endless layers of abstraction. Can you sort of elaborate on that and what? Because I just find it fascinating.
Right. Yeah, this is really interesting, isn't it? So imagine the amount of infrastructure that you have now. Imagine that all of it is bare metal, and then multiply that by multiple orders of magnitude. So you have an immense amount of compute across a whole bunch of data centers. So what do we need to do? Okay, well, now I need to figure out how to rack and stack, do hardware, maintenance, pulling these servers in and out of rotation. How do you image them? What software do you put on them? Is it conditional or is it, the same everywhere? How much can you do that concurrently? Okay, so let's say you have this fleet. How do you execute work on it? How do you schedule work on it? All right, what about storage? So how do you do storage? So the point I'm making is because of the massive scale, all of the itty bitty problems that are really easy to think about and reason about in a cloud, they're all big, gigantic problems. And there's no way that an individual team is going to be able to solve those problems across the layers that I mentioned. I wasn't even talking about network, right? And the data rate that's going through those data centers is absurdly high. So all of those really big hyperscale problems, they need to delegate each of them to their own team. And then beyond, just scheduling work, well, now you have a bunch of engineering teams that are doing all of the various features expressed as stateful and stateless services across the organization. And then all of them are depending on each other because you're basically building like an SOA or gigantic microservices constellation on top of this massive thing. So as I'm describing this to you, I think I'm hopefully it's starting to reveal itself as to why you would be in a situation where I'm on a team that depends on a whole bunch of services underneath me, and I know how to interact with those services. Mm-hmm. And I am providing a service to the teams above me, and they are depending on me and submitting, support questions or on-call escalations. That is why. It's just the scale of the problem is so massive, and the amount of hardware is so massive, and the number of customers is so massive that you naturally are going to operate this way.
It sounds like you would have to have some pretty clear contracts about what you're going to provide to the teams that depend on you and what the teams you depend on are going to provide to you to make that work, right? And a certain amount of trust as well.
Yes, absolutely. And some of that can be achieved through relationship. And, luckily at Meta, they ran their own internal version of Meta for themselves. It's a social network. So that culture is part of the company, but there's also like I mentioned, programmatic ways of interaction. So we can talk a little bit about that too. At Meta and other companies, I'm talking about an open source project, nothing proprietary here. There is a way that you're able to create a common interface between the services in your system. A common tool for that is Thrift. Now, Apache Thrift is very interesting in that for any service that you build, you're able to define its inputs and outputs, its endpoints, the data types expected, and then you're implementing the service in whatever language you want. But because every service is using Thrift, it makes it very simple for services to talk to each other because everyone's speaking the same language, which is really important at scale. there's some other things that are very interesting. There is a concept of services that is codified. Every service has an on-call rotation. Every on-call rotation must have at least one human in it. So there are some, software-driven enforcement to make these relationships between teams happen. There's tools that allow you to create incidents very easily and escalate them to those on-calls, as I mentioned, because every service has an on-call, and every on-call is staffed by at least one person. There is a guarantee that you're going to be able to reach someone if you need help, right? So that is, the programmatic way of making sure that interactions between teams happen. But then there's also just the social substrate of what it means to work at a company like this. One of the really cool things about Meta that I really appreciated was the concept of fast feedback. Feedback is probably one of the biggest, cultural norms at that place, where there was a explicit understanding that if there's something that you need, or something isn't working well, or if something's going well, that you should communicate that to your peers on your team as well as other teams. People are exercising the emotional intelligence to internalize that feedback in a way that is productive, as well as deliver it in a way that is productive and not destructive. So the technology, as well as the social rules, which are instilled in engineers right when they start, allows for the ability for all of these teams to interact with each other and operate in tandem, albeit independently, to create hyperscale products.
To me, that sounds like a topic that we could cover in another episode. This whole idea of how we organize teams so that they can communicate effectively, and there's trust and there's contracts, and providing fast feedback as well. That's a great topic. The other thing, with what you describe at Meta with the layers of abstraction, and you're one small piece, you can specialize very deeply in a particular area because you need to be really good at this one thing. Whereas perhaps in a smaller organization, even if it's fairly large still, you're probably going to have to be more of a generalist and have a wider set of skills, which might mean you're not as hot in a particular area as a sort of consequence of that. Do you think that's a fair sort of assessment?
For the most part, yes. Being that I've operated in both settings, I find that to be true. And at Meta, engineers tend to be encouraged as well to specialize in one chunk of the service that they're in. The scope that you are responsible for can be pretty tiny. And, as you, let's say, progress in the organization and get promoted and things like that, your scope may get larger in terms of providing direction, roadmap. But even still, the team that you're on, that you're still operating within that bounding box of what you're responsible for, unless you're interacting with your peer teams, but still it's from the context of what it is that you're delivering. When I was at Acquia early game as an ops person, I had to learn about everything. I had to learn about, AWS, EC2, S3, EBS, all the failure modes of those things. I had to learn about SMTP because, of course, mail was a part of the product because Drupal websites generate mail for their clients. I had to think about the business. I had to interact with teams like account management and think about, ARR and renewals and a whole lot of business functions that, in a gigantic organization, you'd never have to think about. I think your depiction of large companies, smaller scope specialization and generalist in a startup is pretty spot on.
And I guess it would suit different people. So some people would prefer to be more generalist and to touch on a lot of different areas and their brains just work that way, or they like to see the big context. And I guess other people really like to be really, really, really good at one thing. So
yeah. I think that was the big lesson that I learned, working for Meta, because there was a cultural tension between the way that I operated as a professional and the way that the company was set up, because I realize I am a generalist. I know a lot about a whole lot of stuff. And I tend to think about problems in terms of people and teams and processes and systems. And I'm looking very big picture. I'm not necessarily going miles deep on a specific problem. And because of that, I think there were moments where, I was generating friction in terms of how I was interacting on the team or how my performance was being judged because of that lens. It wasn't malicious. It's just the nature of the business, which is probably why I'm, again, a consultant today, because as a consultant, you're responsible for providing guidance and expertise on a great many number of things.
I'm a different kind of generalist. I mean, I don't know much about anything. But seriously, as a performance engineer tester, I didn't really know what I was a specialist in, because I would just move to all kinds of different projects and technologies, and I was not an expert in anything. The only real hard skills I had were how to workload model and understand the activity happening on a service or in a system, how to simulate that in an effective and somewhat accurate way, and the biggest one was analyzing data, whether it's some sort of monitoring or test results, big, massive amounts of data. That's the only skills that I had. And it was I often would get imposter syndrome, because I didn't know, I wasn't an expert on a particular programming language or a technology stack or Kubernetes or whatever it was, It ate away at me.
Yeah. I mean, I deal with imposter syndrome? Absolutely. Absolutely. It definitely happens, especially when you are operating in a generalist mindset. So to your point, yes, you learned to play the game of performance engineering and how to create test suites for you to assess the performance characteristics of a system. But there's all this stuff in the periphery that you need to do that you might not be super experienced with. You are providing value, but yes, you're having to grow in those areas. It doesn't mean that you're not a competent value providing engineer, right? And I think for me, one of the big lessons I've had to learn is that I don't have to know everything. It's good. It's okay to learn to know a little bit about everything, and then the big piece of the puzzle is the willingness to learn. The eagerness to learn allows you to be parachuted into a mess, as my boss used to say when describing me, and then just assimilate whatever information that is in front of me and then start making decisions. I think that is really what is necessary for a generalist, because you're going to be in unfamiliar territory all the time, if you're operating like that.
Okay. We are pretty much coming up on time, but just to finish off, can you tell me a story about your career? Something that was interesting that happened or dramatic?
How about I tell you the story about how I almost burnt down the server room at my first tech job.
Physically burned?
Well, no, just really, really high heat. No fire was involved, but yes, I did say that for dramatic impact. But how I exposed a whole bunch of servers to very, very, very high heat and made it very hot in the server room, I could talk about that.
Yeah, let's do this.
So how did I burn down the server room? So what I was just out of college and I was working on my alma mater, the University of South Florida. I worked for research computing. So they ran Beowulf clusters, and our customers were, of course, research professors and their teams to run, their scientific compute on these systems. So in the library on the top floor, there was a teeny tiny little data center. It was probably, I don't know, maybe 300 square feet, maybe, if, in just one big hall. And there were a bunch of racks of servers in there. Well, one day I got an alert that something was going on in that room, and we were using Nagios at the time. And I was kind of new to Nagios. I didn't really know how it worked and how to configure it and everything. So I was just getting alerts. So I decided to SSH into the Nagios server and stop the service while I went and fixed the issue. Instead of me downtiming it or acknowledging it. I didn't understand. I just turned the thing off. It's not sending me texts anymore. I'm going to go fix the issue and turn it back on. Right? So I forgot to turn it on after I was done working. And by a stroke of really, really bad luck. Now, remember, I mentioned this was a few hundred square feet, very small room, top floor of the library. I did not say it was an actual data center. The single gigantic air conditioning unit on the back at the top of the building that was responsible for cooling this room failed. And it just was by a stroke of this bad luck that the Nagios service that I turned off was the Nagios service that was responsible for monitoring the ambient temperature of the room. And there was an event handler that was configured in Nagios on this Nagios instance that would go and IPMI kill all of the servers if that were to take place. But because the monitoring system was not on, that did not happen. So when I came in the following morning to start my day, all, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, you could hear off in the distance a little beep, 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 which was basically the APCs just crying and bawling their eyes out. And someone who was working with me in the building was like, Amin, can you go check that out? And I walked back there and I realized what was happening. And I put my hand against the glass because there was a glass, window in front of the room so you can see the servers, and it was hot to touch. So I opened it up. I turned on there was a big fan in there. I blasted all the hot air out of there, turned all the machines off, and I felt so terrible. And my manager was at a conference, so I was minding the store, right? And this happened on my watch, so it was a really vulnerable moment for me, but I managed to come clean and say, yep, this is what happened. And luckily my boss, Brian Smith, he works at Apple now. He was really, really nice and was like, that could have happened to me too. It's totally okay. And thank goodness the servers are very old and they were at their end of life anyway. But yeah, that was the day I burnt down the server room at my first job.
Wow. Oh man, my palms are sweating hearing that story. Thank you for sharing it.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah. That's why I tend to keep postmortems blameless these days, because I know how it feels,
Thank you so much, Amin, for coming back and sharing your experiences at Meta and discussing my previous role and how we could have done the engagement in a different way. And I hope you enjoy your tour, the rest of your tour around the United States.
Thank you. And again, it's good to be here once again.
Do you know where you're going next? Where are you traveling to after Las Vegas?
That's a very interesting question. I have a few candidates on my list. Portland, Oregon might be one of them. Denver, Colorado might be one of them. We'll just have to see.
And for everyone else, I hope you have a wonderful week, and I will see you all next time.